You guys have in mind. So they have started recording. Good morning and thank you for joining us. I'm very happy to welcome prominent lawyer and friend Ahmed Rafi Alam and friend and climate researcher and activist Hassan Sipra to this discussion. We're starting in a time where COVID is not really making a comeback, but making a comeback all the same to Pakistan. We were thinking we might be in a post-COVID environment where we can read of our capacities to adapt, our capacities to protect, our capacities to overturn the exclusions that apply in Pakistan with regard to protecting and safeguarding cohorts from the ravages of climate change. We've heard that story over and over again. But several years into our adaptive overhauls, as well as a grandiose institutional realignment and money spent thereof in the center as well as provinces, we're still scratching our heads whether there is enough evidence from the ground to convince us that adaptive capacities have improved in Pakistan, whether our poor people or those who suffer disproportionately from climate change are safeguarded better. So I'm very happy to have our friends with us who have been looking very closely at demand side as well as supply side issues and keep an ear close to the ground. I'd like to start with Mr. Rafi Alam, who's been involved in several litigations as well as writing and research on this issue. Rafi, is the government really doing better on adaptation? Can we really see the woods from the trees, so to speak? And what evidence do you think in recent times, over the COVID period in particular, have we seen that adaptation mechanisms have gotten better?
Thank you, Salman. Well, let me start with the adaptation question you had, especially with respect to COVID. If I can take you back earlier in the year to about March, when the virus was spreading in Pakistan, Sindh as a province started to take action and issue lockdowns, which was different from other provinces. There was a suo motu in the Supreme Court, and the federal government was taking a position that Sindh was hindering the sort of pandemic relief operations. The Supreme Court also came out and said that the province of Sindh must coordinate with Islamabad. And so the legal backdrop to this is, of course, that health and health responses are provincial subjects to be determined by the federating unit themselves. And as the sort of pandemic lockdowns started, or as the virus started spreading, what we saw was, instead of an exercise of power and jurisdiction or writ by the provincial governments, we saw a reflex action by the Supreme Court and through the creation of this national command and control entity that centralizes the health response to the virus. So what we saw in the early stages was actually a reflexive centralization of power rather than the decentralized post-18th Amendment sort of structure that should have taken place. And this is indeed worrying, because when you look at the scale of the climate crisis we are facing and are to face, this year the Karachi rains are a standout moment of a climate event, as was the plague of locusts that ate away swathes of Sindh and Punjab and even KP, parts of India as well. So when we come to climate events, what I'm afraid of is seeing sort of climate responses being centralized by government rather than letting the provincial units take their responsibility and fulfill their own. And it's an attractive argument to suggest that disaster management and climate response should be centralized. And maybe that's a technical argument that some can make. But look, I'm a lawyer. And the thing I reach to first is the Constitution of Pakistan. And the Constitution doesn't look at these technical problems that way. So what we have then is a need for the federating units to start coordinating with one another, a sort of federative diplomacy that should be one of the cause of a climate adaptive response, rather than this knee-jerk centralization response that we're seeing.
That's quite an interesting point, and I'd like to maybe extend that discussion a little bit. I think Rafe makes good reference to the 18th Amendment as well as federative diplomacy. And to my mind, that suggests a flow of rights from the Constitution to the federating powers to the provinces. So, Hassan, do you think there is a case for rights here, for a rights-based diplomacy here?
Well, before I get into, like, let's say the rights aspect to it, if we look at the climate change adaptation measures that we have to take, they all have to occur at the local level. And by local, we mean like district and beyond, down to the community level. So where COVID has been interesting for Pakistan has been really because of the way we sort of took this massive Sindh approach first, then the center started pushing. But at the end of the day, when we started doing those mini and smart lockdowns, where we started going down to the community level, that's where we started to see the most impact, actually. That's when we locked down certain, I know in Islamabad at least, we locked down streets within sectors, and that contained the cases a bit better than the other way. That's the sort of approach that one has to take to climate change as well, in that since the impacts are going to be local, they're going to be on a 5 by 5 kilometer radius, for example, and then you can split the entire country at that level and say, well, what are the impacts on this 5 by 5, and then how do we build investment into that? That is actually what drives innovation and adaptation both. So I think that's a crucial lesson that we've learned out of COVID, is that at the local level is where the largest impact investment can be made for any sort of pandemic or disaster or climate risk that we're facing in the future. But we still need to clarify and engage on greater discussion about those federating rights, right? As in, if Sindh was able to, why was Sindh able to push so much in the beginning of the COVID response versus the center pushing in a different direction? Like, where are those mechanisms? And I'm not a lawyer, so I would put this to you and Rafe, is like, what are those key coordinating units in the middle or offices that actually can make that sort of dialogue happen and that transition happen towards where the 18th Amendment fully empowers provinces, and by doing so, districts and local communities.
So what you're suggesting is then there is this framework, this institutional architecture, without the requisite connectors there necessarily. I don't see that policy is in crisis here. I feel that there is a deficit in people who can actually make this work, but at multiple levels. This 5 by 5 algorithm that you've shared with us, Rafa, I'd like you to weigh in on this and let us know what the institutional arrangement is really like, because you've been looking at it, studying it very critically.
One very good example of a post-18th Amendment decentralized disaster management authority is the National Disaster Management Authority, believe it or not, which has a disaster management council, the convener of which is the Prime Minister. It has all the chief ministers. It has the foreign minister. It has people from disaster management, from finance, and it's supposed to set the disaster policy for Pakistan. But the inclusion of the chief ministers is very important, because the National Disaster Management Authority not only creates this council, but also creates the NDMA to enforce and disaster management protocols and to take action. That's the authority to take action. And the policy-making body for this authority has not just the Prime Minister, but the 4 chief ministers in it as well. So there is democratic participation of the provinces in disaster management at the national level. But the Act goes further and also creates provincial disaster management authorities, which have their own powers to take action and to formulate provincial disaster management plans. And not just that, but then the Act also, and it's a central Act, also empowers provincial governments to notify district disaster management authorities, whose job it is to provide support and inputs to the provincial disaster management authorities. And you get this integrated triangle of disaster relief institutions. And it's something, again, that we've seen rolled out in Pakistan. Now, within the NDMA and how it works now, as opposed to what the letter of the law says, is also very interesting, because it reflects that reflex I was talking about earlier. If you look at the NDMA and how it operationally carries out its duties, you'll find again that it's not very decentralized at all. The provincial disaster management authorities hardly exist, and the district disaster management authorities are very low on capacity as well. So again, in the legislation itself, you see a reflexive, maybe a political reality of sorts playing out with a centralization of power. But nevertheless, in terms of legislation and legislative policy after the 18th Amendment, this is a fantastic way of looking at how you can have sort of federative diplomacy in these subjects.
So, Rafi, I'm curious whether we have this elaborate arrangement in place, but did it successfully respond to COVID? Is one question, and both of you can weigh in on this. Did it really do the trick with regard to what we needed on COVID? We saw a very centralized response actually being led by the PM himself and his cohort of advisors. What then is the agitation for a decentralized structure? If you could explicitly make a case for why this is necessary, and why perhaps, as Hassan was saying, there is need for considering a kind of new social contract in climate activism and climate change action. Does all of this come together at some level then? And we can start that conversation as we go. Go ahead, Rafi.
A fair point. But the question is, what is a successful response to the pandemic? How are we going to define success or a successful response? We had actually earlier this year anticipated as many as 2 million cases to have spread through Pakistan by June. And I checked, as a matter of fact, today, that figure is just about 314,000 cases. So you could argue that that is a success based on early projections. But at the same time, the thousands of people who have perished this year are no measure of success as well. So the question is, how do you define success? I think earlier what Hassan was talking about, the sort of initiatives and the sort of strategies where specific areas were targeted using technology and decentralized responses proved to be successful. So it's difficult to assess success, but there are things that appear to have worked. But what's interesting about the things that have worked, because the smart lockdowns also took place in Lahore, there were about a dozen different localities that were sealed. The interesting thing is that the successful initiatives within this overall response seem to be decentralized, relying on local information and local responses. So the success story itself points towards the need to have decentralized control. Now, the thing is, from a legal point of view, because this is an issue, this idea about decentralizing these disaster management or COVID response, or even climate change or water, for example, because all of these things, it can be argued, should be at some level technically coordinated centrally. Water passes through all 4 provinces, and therefore there should be a central mechanism to control it. Climate doesn't respect national or provincial boundaries, so we should have, federal control over climate and environment. While that's technically an attractive argument, I come back to what I was saying earlier, that according to our constitution, that's not how it works. And so from a very straightforward legal perspective, doing it that way is illegal. Either you change the constitution to reflect the will of the people who say, yes, there's a better technical way of doing this. Or you understand that the constitution contains these elements of democratic mandate that allow decision makers to respond to their constituencies and their responsibilities better. And then you begin to understand that, look, decentralization isn't about what's technically right or wrong. It's about how people can govern themselves. And again, we see with the successful COVID initiatives, it's been the decentralized responses that have proven to be successful.
Hassan, would you like to come in? Before that, can I just welcome Anam Zaib, who's just joined us. Anam Zaib, we can't see you. If you could turn on your video, that'll be fantastic. Anam works at the International Rescue Committee, and we'll just I'll just have a question for you, Anam. Hassan, would you like to respond to what Rafa was saying?
Yeah, I actually would. I had a little add-on to what Rafa is saying. The this whole idea of decentralized response in COVID, what we've learned from it, and that perhaps that is what's successful. It actually brings up an interesting point about our climate adaptation needs and assessments. So every year our government says our need for adaptation is $7 to $14 billion every year. That's larger than our military budget, the known one at least, right? So how the key question is to build the capacities of various coordinating agencies all the way down to that local level, to that district level. That's what actually costs $7 to $14 billion in adaptation. It's because the money is calculated to be the amount that a local constituency or unit, community would be spending for their efforts. And all the rest of it is attached administrative fees in essence, right? So the scale is so large that I don't think us dipping our toe just into COVID really tells us all that much, other than, yeah, this works. It validates that whole idea that going down to the local community is actually what is successful, or what seems to be successful. To date, very few actual scientific studies have now been done on the COVID environment in Pakistan. And so as we get more and more data, it'll help us understand better and better how well this mechanism actually worked. And that gives us time, I think, 2022 all the way to 2025 to really prepare for the next stage of Paris Agreement implementation activities and our NDC reporting and these types of things. That's what it sets us up for. It tells us that it costs us $424 million right now, just in 6 months, to cover just one pandemic. And sure, it's a pandemic that's thrashed the world over, but it's the sheer size difference between this and the COVID and the climate response is an order of magnitude. 424 million spent right now versus 7 to 14 billion needed every year just for adaptation. In the near-term future, that cost ramps up rapidly the farther out we get. So I think that while we can say that COVID has taught us certain things, we can't actually say that it's applicable fully to climate governance. There are good lessons in there, but there are also some lessons that are not at all applicable.
For sure. I think that lesson has been taken and reflected by many climate experts, that there is no direct correlation between action for COVID and how it has a bearing on our ability to govern climate better. I want to change tack a little bit here, and as well as add that Jinnah Institute is also trying to crash a report on COVID responses, and one of them is in the domain of climate change, and Rafa will be taking that forward. Anam, what you work in the international governance space, and what metrics of adaptability do you look out for, or what multilaterals look out for, is one question for you. And then, are any of these necessarily reflected from the last 6 months in Pakistan?
It's actually funny. The adaptation and mitigation, when you look at the two of them, mitigation is generally something that's slightly more straightforward. So the question with mitigation is, you reduce your emissions, whatever those are, whether those are greenhouse gases or greenhouse gas equivalents. And, then depending on the market mechanism you're going for, whether you're going to carbon markets or it's not easy. No one wants to do it, but at least it's straightforward. With adaptation, or with building resilience, as we like to call it, it's a much more tricky sort of, metric to go to, because adaptation can and does, and resilience does encompass everything. So a more resilient person is economically more resilient, is socially more resilient, has much more tools at their disposal. It also has a much more services available to them. So a resilient community has a lot more going for them. So adaptation activities or adaptation actions are much more difficult to pin down, than it is to pin down a mitigation activity. So adaptation, we're increasingly starting to realize that adaptation actually encompasses all kinds of development, right? That can include the building of infrastructure, that can also include improved education and improved economic opportunities to a certain community to be able to, cope with whatever disaster nature throws at them, or disaster climate change throws at them, based on what the world is going through right now. So pinning down adaptation activities, and when we say adaptation needs are going to be much higher, and that we're going to need 7 to 14 billion, and this is based on a 2012 study, by the way. We haven't really had any studies since then saying what our revised cost of adaptation may be based on current market prices. We don't really have that pinned down. Our provinces and our national climate change policies, are a wish list of activities that we can have to adapt to climate change. They are not linked to an implementation framework, but most importantly, they're not linked to a financial framework. So where will the money come from? We can very well say that we will need 7 to 14, or in some cases, they say 5 to 18 billion dollars per year. Again, based on the 2012 study, no recent study has been done. But where will that money come from? And unfortunately, the important bit of this whole thing is the money. The magnitude of the challenge is such that we will never be able to deal with it based on domestic climate finance alone. Overseas development assistance, we've seen over the past decades that it hasn't really made a huge change. So there are only two options. One of them is the international climate finance, and the other one, of course, is private sector finance. And both of these companies, both of these, trails of finance are very much focused on mitigation at the moment, and they kind of, treat adaptation as a side activity. It's not given as much emphasis as mitigation is, which I mean is justified in its own right. So as far as the Pakistan's response, and as far as adaptation options are concerned, of course, you can argue that any development activities that are taking place that are defined in our ADPs, we have started at the federal level a climate budget tagging system. So you tag the expenditures in the PSDPs and the ADPs. Some of the provinces are attempting to do this process as well. KPI, I believe, has had a similar activity, where you tag activities under the budget as whether they fall under adaptation or mitigation, and it helps you plan better finance for both. But again, how much of that is actually spent, how effective are these actions, and how do you pin down what constitutes adaptation and what doesn't, because everything can constitute adaptation, but getting the private sector on board arguably is probably one of the best bets that we have, and something that we're failing to do in Pakistan. Actually, we're only relying on CSR and not going beyond that too much.
So here's another question for you, Anam. You looked at the federal policy framework. You've also been leading, provincial frameworks, how they come together for adaptation and mitigation. Given all of this political economy on budgeting and our deficits thereof, do you think our government is really planting more and more trees to be able to create carbon sinks? And that in my mind is responding to the mitigation aspect, not so much the adaptation. Do our increased green endowments per capita really improve the lot of, say, forest communities? Does it really improve the lot of our population overall? Is one question. And then in our governmental responses, is there a wish list for adaptation anywhere? Is there a priority list or action 1, 2, or 3, or how we're going to chart this?
We have a couple of things going on. So to address your question about the tree plantation, there are very obvious things that are budgeted under the head of climate change. So for example, at the provincial level, the KP Environment Department's expenditures would probably all be tagged as being adaptation or, mitigation related. But then you have expenditures that the Agriculture Department may be doing, such as the lining of, previously abandoned irrigation channels, for example, that were causing a lot of water losses and stuff. And that might be, something that we could build as an adaptation initiative. So similarly, you find this across all the provinces that, this is something, there are expenditures that we are doing that are adaptation or mitigation expenditures, but just because the Environment Department or the PDMA or whatever SDMA, KP, Disaster Management Authority, just because they aren't directly undertaking these expenditures in their annual development plans, we are not considering them to be climate-related expenditures. So, and then of course, there are also climate-negative expenditures. So maybe there's a lot of activities that our governments are undertaking at the provincial level that are detrimental to the climate. And, they're probably undoing a lot of the good work that the governments are inadvertently doing and the money that they're inadvertently spending on climate change adaptation. So yes, the national climate change and the provincial climate change policies are definitely, they do set out a wish list of adaptation activities. There's not really much prioritization of how these activities will take place. There's also the token mention of gender in each one of these policies, but not really too much mainstreaming of it. There's usually a separate section on gender, just to show that this has been included into this policy. So, there's that aspect of it as well. And at the same time, you also have to consider that adaptation at this point for us is something that we need to do. It's not something that we have too much of an option about. So there's probably adaptation that's taking place on an individual level that we don't even realize. People have been shifting their sowing patterns for their crops, and people have been changing, all kinds of ways of life, their water consumption, the means that they get water from for their daily use. All of these things have been shifting around and changing. And these all come under adaptation. So actually measuring how much is actually spent on adaptation, how much is actually spent on mitigation is something that's really difficult to pin down, which is why I kept saying that we do need another study. Relying on data from 2012 probably doesn't paint an accurate picture of what actually happened. The UNDP has led the CPIR, Climate Public Expenditure and Institutional Review processes, once in 2015 and once in 2017. That might be a good starting point to see how much is actually being spent. And I'm emphasizing on finance and expenditure just because at this point, this is probably the best indication that we have to track expenditures, because that's the biggest repository we have of what activities are actually going on. We don't have any other records other than that, unfortunately. As far as the tree plantation goes, it's always a good thing to plant trees. If the tree plantation initiative is linked to the global RED initiatives, where we can use this for, building our carbon credits and building up on finance related to REDD+, then it is definitely an initiative that could contribute further than just being a carbon sink. So yeah, I'll hand over to you again.
Thank you for that comprehensive intervention. And I'd like to come to Hassan Sipra, who's been doing some field work, collecting evidence, activating machinery around Punjab to test smog, etc. These are all individual experiments, CSR backed. Hassan, could you reflect on some other evidence that you may have put together, organizations that you know have put together, which improve our understanding of what the effects of climate change are?
So the key thing I can speak to about the impacts of climate change, if we just boil them down to precipitation and temperature, and really it's precipitation that's the real important one that we need a lot of adaptation towards. We have, in essence, been seeing a shift in our monsoon, more inwards into Pakistan, with intensity increasing, as well as the frequency of precipitation events increasing. We also at the north have, Glacier Lake outburst flooding. We have heat waves in the south, which are all expected to increase. Now, at the same time, we also have a problem in Pakistan of rural to urban migration. This is now showing where we need the money to go, right? 7 to 14 billion and a wish list away. Like, these are all very valid points Anam's making. We do need to update our data. We actually need a continuum of diverse data collected. What helped us through COVID was the fact that we were immediately starting to get data that was telling us how many people have the disease and how many people are dying from it. We started getting it from WHO, then Pakistan set up its own dashboard, which really, in a way, helps people understand the scope and set the narrative for that. So when we see our Karachi flooding, when we see our Karachi heat waves, when we see food security problems in Punjab, when we see air quality issues in Lahore, we start to become aware and we start to visualize our own climate reality. And in doing so, we are going to start seeing more and more financing that actually makes sense to place in certain places, to place in certain allotment slots. That's why it's also very good to have the climate public expenditure and institution review, because it at least tells us that, okay, we are already at about 8%. How do we ramp this all the way up to 100%? But the process for all of this requires an iterative public policy making approach, which means that we need to not only institutionalize certain principles, but also then activate those institutions. Like, for example, the Climate Change Authority, which still is not operationalized. Rafe will speak about that, I'm sure, very soon. But we need all of these things to work in tandem with the research and the data that's coming in. We already know where the major impacts are going to be. Now it's just a question of, well, how large of an impact is it, and how much investment is needed to change that impact? So one thing that I would advocate the most for Pakistan when you look at your climate adaptation needs is that Pakistan needs to start optimizing what are called global climate models. So there's about 18 to 20 global climate centers whose entire job is to just project climate change. These are the models that go into the IPCC reports, which then go to the UNFCCC, which then makes its decisions on the scientific, which then makes policy decisions on the basis of the scientific evidence. Pakistan does not have its own climate research center that does modeling work, that figures out what it is that works for us. Because if you look at US examples, if you look at Chinese examples, or Australia or India or Russia or any of these other major countries that have their own climate centers, they're able to optimize those to their environments, to their localities. And they don't do that for Pakistan. So we use the same data, but that data isn't optimized for Pakistan. It isn't optimized for India, so India has developed its own. And now India is using that one to really get to that 5x5 square model that I was talking about. So when I was speaking about the 5x5 square, I really meant we need to know exactly how much is going to precipitate on this section right here. Because if you don't know that, you can't make short-term, medium-term, or long-term decisions about it. So I think that it's crucial that within all of these wish lists that we have, we start to give them structure. I agree that they are wish lists, but they're all important. How do you prioritize Armageddon, or an apocalypse? Maybe an apocalypse is going too far, but it is a substantial transformation that needs to take place for the world and for Pakistan specifically. That is adaptation focused for sure, but without the data, it won't get there. And we've now got only a certain amount of time to actually get there. By 2030, we're already expected to cross 1.5, which is, in terms of Pakistan, 1.5 is actually closer to 3 to 4, right? For us, that's a 3 to 4 degree change, which is already described as hellish by the IPCC and UNFCCC. We have the information available to us. It's about generating the institution, strengthening our institutional organizations to then generate the data and then to move forward on policy with an evidence-based approach. And in order to do that, we have to keep trying to somewhat wrestle with it. With these institutions have to keep wrestling with each other until they arrive at an equilibrium where they are managing their climate finance and their climate governance better.
There seems to be a determinism in government to go down the same path that was figured out in 2012, where evidence does not seem to have creeped up to the highest levels of authority, where we are still talking in the same language and the same idiom as, perhaps 8 years ago. The world has clearly moved on. And not that the world has done very well. We track how other countries are doing at the UNFCCC. But Pakistan seems to have lost its record. The last 3 years have been a series of the same reports and the same evidence posted over and over again. So I'd like to maybe, if you could address whether any path dependencies have been broken, or are we still stuck in the same groove as 8 years ago or 10 years ago?
Thanks, that's a great question. And the short answer is no, actually. The path dependencies haven't really been broken. And but let me explain this by this one policy position that's taken with respect to now climate change and previous to that environment. And it's not just this government. This was the exact same policy position that was taken by the PMLN, the PPP, the PMLQ. You go back as far as you want, and it's the same policy position, which is the following. Firstly, Pakistan is not a big greenhouse gas emitter, so this is not our problem. Secondly, we're signatory to UNFCCC, Kyoto, and Paris, and we comply with all of our requirements. And specific to this government, there's a policy position now which is summarized: look, trees. And with these three policy positions, we managed to deflect any investigation or further investigation into what climate change is and how it's going to impact Pakistan. And the truth is that this policy position ignores just how bad the climate crisis is. Hassan mentioned that we're locked into shooting past the 1.5 degree limit set by the Paris Agreement. We're actually locked in with the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today to a 3-degree increase in temperature by mid-century. Now, you have to understand that these limits under Kyoto of 2 degrees or under Paris of 1.5 degrees aren't triggers where if you get to that sort of temperature, things will start happening. We are in 2020 slightly over a degree centigrade higher than pre-industrial levels. And we are seeing unprecedented wildfires in the Arctic. We're seeing the melting of the permafrost and the sort of tipping of greenhouse gas emissions. We've seen wildfires in California. We've seen 2 hurricanes in the Atlantic this year in the US for the first time at the same time. We've seen wildfires in Australia. There's been flooding in India. There have been locusts in Pakistan. And this is just at 1 degree. What you have to understand is that these limits, so to speak, are actually the politically acceptable amount of damage that the international community is willing to bear, right? And what we have to understand is that from this point onwards, it's pain. It's not like things are going to start happening at 1.5 degrees. It's pain now. The unseasonal rains that fell in Punjab in April last year, which was a climate event, incidentally, wiped out a substantial portion of the wheat crop. And then coupled with bad decisions on wheat export, we actually had a wheat shortage this year. So we're seeing these things actually play out. We don't seem to understand how bad it's going to get because these policy positions, look, trees, we're not big greenhouse gas emitters, we're signatories, hide the truth in reality. The truth in reality is the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of global warming is approximately 150 million deaths, mostly in Asian and African cities, on account of air pollution caused by greenhouse gas emissions. That's just 1.5 degree of temperature increase. There is not a single seed or tree that can survive a 3-degree temperature increase, which is expected by 2050. So we're going to start seeing collapses in agricultural systems and agricultural chains. We're going to start seeing collapses in society taking place by mid-century. I'm not talking about the extinction of the world, but certainly the systems that we have relied upon as a society to keep our governments going, to keep ourselves going, are going to now face stresses that they've never encountered before. And we're not prepared for that. Because look, Pakistan's not a big greenhouse gas emitter and we're a signatory to the Paris Agreement. But the truth is, being a signatory to the Paris Agreement doesn't mean much. Because firstly, Paris is a voluntary agreement. Countries undertake to do their best to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And Pakistan's stated policy with respect to this is not to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, but to hide behind the fact that it's a developing country. And under the INDC that we filed under in 2016, we actually are going to ramp up greenhouse gas emissions by a factor of 400% between 2015 and 2030. We are going exactly the opposite direction. So being a signatory to the Paris Agreement doesn't mean anything. And in any case, being signatory and complying with the Paris Agreement doesn't mean much either, because mostly what the Paris Agreement requires from Pakistan is to report its greenhouse gas inventories every 5 years, which is something we have done, albeit delayed according to the time schedule set out by the United Nations. So it's not like we're setting the world on fire with our brilliance over here. The point is, I come back to this, that climate change is about pain. And as Hassan said, we do not have, because of these policy positions that we've taken, we do not have the ability to know. We don't have the knowledge of what's going to happen when it rains 6 inches in Karachi. We don't know how climate change is going to be different in Badin as compared to Charsata or Mardan, because no local analysis has taken place. We just have some folks in Islamabad telling you that, look, we've planted lots of trees. And the truth with the trees, again, is that it's carbon sequestration. It's not greenhouse gas reduction or elimination. And right now, the climate crisis is all about greenhouse gas reduction. This idea of having carbon zero by 2050 isn't good enough. We are at ecological tipping point, and we have to start looking at getting rid of greenhouse gases or their production, and changing the way society is organized very rapidly. As a matter of fact, just a few days ago, with this announcement that 1.5 degrees of warming is a technical possibility, it will require
Sorry, Rafi's picture has gotten stuck, team. If you can resolve that, we can maybe bring Rafi in a couple of minutes. Anam, I'd like to refer that question to you. Or Rafi, you're back on. Sorry, would you want to complete that thought? No, picture still seems to be stuck. Anam, I'll refer that to you, that same thought from Rafi. The international regime is stuck somewhere. And as Rafi suggests, doing the minimal on the damage that we have agreed to do to ourselves is really just that, sticking it at 2 degrees Celsius, where perhaps all projections are maybe going to, as Rafi says, move us in the other direction by 2050. Now, are there lessons from the international environment that maybe both you and Hassan can speak of that have been taken with regard to this, not just in Pakistan or the region, but perhaps lessons from elsewhere, from similar contexts in Africa or other developing contexts where, the lot of populations has been improved. And here I'd like to recommend the lens of vulnerability. Has that necessarily gone away? If you can respond to that and give us examples, and we'll come back to Rafi in a bit. Go ahead, Anna.
Hi, thank you, Salman. I'll just be very quick because I want to hear what Rafi has to say to continue with what he was saying. But yes, of course, there have been local examples. Pakistan, we have a tendency to compare ourselves to countries like Bangladesh or Nepal or Sri Lanka, but in some ways that may be correct, and in some ways we are a very different context than other countries. We all have our own developing profile and stuff, but what we do learn from some of these other countries is that it's not impossible. In Bangladesh, there was a very successful solarization project where households were encouraged to install renewable energy in the form of solar panels on their rooftops. This had individual benefits for people. So, of course, they were getting electricity. The government was meeting its targets in terms of mitigation. So, in terms of not producing CO2 emissions from energy production or from power production. And at the same time, any gains that there were being made in solar energy, so any excess solar energy that was being produced by the household, was being added to the national grid. And of course, the households were actually being compensated financially for that. So this was a sort of win-win situation that was in Bangladesh. I think this was in around 2009. It was a pilot that was undertaken and was very successful. This is something that can be replicated. This was done through a large portion of Dhaka. So this is something that we could possibly replicate in Pakistan. And my point in picking out such an example is that we need to change the way that we are communicating climate change and the solutions that we have to it. Um, Unfortunately, people are not very ethical, and leave people out of it. Companies are not ethical, and neither are governments. They don't have the moral compass that an individual does. So you can tell them as much as you want that the world is going to suffer, and nature is going to suffer, ecosystems are going to suffer, and the biome is going to suffer if the temperature rises. It's not going to appeal to them until you put a financial or monetary benefit on top of it. So with the private sector companies, other than legislation and pushing them into it, we know that they're responsible for climate change. It's not the individual that is. We have to incentivize their investments into climate change and make it more profitable for them to be investing into greener business. It has to make more sense for this to happen financially. Similarly, for individuals also, you can tell, a farmer from my village in Mardan that it's really, really important for him to be using solar energy and not relying on electricity because, environment and, the temperature is going to rise by two degrees, by in the next 20 years. That's not going to really speak to his heart too much, unfortunately. But if you do tell him that installing solar panels on his roof is going to solve his electricity problem, and he's not going to have hours of load shedding, and he and his family can have more time together at night because they can light a bulb and they can, turn on the fan when their children feel hot, that's going to appeal to them more. So we have to change the way that we're communicating climate change at a local level. We have to make it more appealing. We also have to create an enabling environment for the private sector to be investing more and more in green friendly businesses. So we'll come back to that thought, I think, in a little while. For now, I just want to hear what Rafi has to say about what he was saying earlier.
Sure. Thanks, Anam, for that analysis of the political economy. I do want to sort of come back to this sort of arrangement of the political economy and solutions later on. But Rafi, back to you to complete that thought about
Yes.
the international regime and what Greek has agreed to do. Go ahead, Rafi.
I think he's frozen again.
Team at the back end, if you can fix that, please, and help Rafi back into the studio. Hassan, would you like to go ahead and respond to some of Anam was saying, as well as
Yeah,
you might have.
I actually thought that it's an interesting conversation to look at other countries and who Pakistan compares itself to. But I think that given that climate change has a largely regional context as well, it makes sense to look at it from the perspective of, like, let's say, how does it compare against like Sino-African trade? We can see, and I mean that's now getting into the CPEC territory a little bit, right? Which plays a huge role in Pakistan's adaptation and mitigation plans. It must play a huge role. It currently plays, I think, a minimal role, but that definitely needs to happen. So what a lot of countries in Africa that have had successful trade relations with China have basically been able to do so by having inclusive policies. And that, I think, is the crucial way to actually work with your Chinese investment, is to make sure that every single rupee that comes in of that investment is tied in somehow to inclusive development, which means, like the jobs that you're creating, what are the sort of health benefits, the health co-benefits that go with that. So if you're going to be employing people at a coal power plant, what are the sort of health implications over there, and how do you offset those as well? If you are having a hydroelectric dam that needs to be built and you have to relocate a bunch of people and you need to cause a certain environmental impact, well, how are you giving those people their due, for example? These would be, I think, crucial questions that policymakers have the power to actually negotiate. And they can only negotiate that if, again, they get that information from the localmost level all the way to the topmost level. So I think that's the idea of inclusivity in your financing is something that we don't, in this country, really have a dialogue for, particularly at the level of policymakers. Building that up, I think, is the goal for the next few years to really ramp up the sort of decision-making that needs to be done for financing climate adaptation.
Rafi, if you could also respond to that, our abilities to create consensus on national and international debates, particularly using the forums that we Council of Common Interests, or the Parliament itself, or even multilateral forums like the UNFCCC. But back to what you were saying, and perhaps if you could respond to this as well. Thanks.
Thank you. I apologize, we were having some poor connections. Hopefully they're resolved now. No, I wanted to respond to what Anam was saying about how it's necessary sometimes to provide financial viability to people to sort of convince them to move on to the path of adaptation. And I just am reminded of how recently NEPRA, which sets electricity tariffs for energy in Pakistan, under NEPRA tariffs, renewable tariffs are cheaper than all the fossil fuel-based tariffs that are operating in Pakistan today. So it is actually financially more viable to have renewable energy in Pakistan than it is to have coal-fired or furnace oil-based electricity. But surprisingly, despite the fact that it's financially viable to go one way, we are now stuck with long-term IPP contracts, which will burn fossil fuels for electricity in Pakistan for the next 30 years. I'm afraid that this argument that financial viability is necessary isn't enough. It's necessary, but I'll explain why it isn't enough. Because as we're stuck with these long-term IPP contracts, we find that actually, given Pakistan's history in challenging challenging international contracts has been to its disadvantage. There's not a single court of law that will strike these down, perhaps. And that's quite unfortunate, because you can't, as you can begin to see, you can't fight this climate problem using existing laws or existing financial models. Because we are here on the climate crisis because of the existence of certain systems, and I'll name them. It's capitalism, patriarchy, consumerism, and the fossil fuel-based economy. And you can't get out of the climate crisis by using instruments of these systems. You have to fight these systems and be against them. I mean, capitalism is a system of the accumulation of capital at the cost of the destruction of natural resources. Patriarchy is a system of hierarchy, putting man at the center of what is essentially an economic consumption and control pattern, creating discrimination against women systemically. And consumerism is the habits that we have, like these mobile phones, and the energy intensity that we have. So really what we need is not just arguments about financial sustainability, but anti-capitalist arguments. I'm not talking socialist. Anti-capitalist doesn't mean socialist or Marxist. Patriarchy doesn't mean pro-feminist. I'm trying to be as neutral in these terms and not loading them politically. I'm trying to look at this analytically. We have to be anti-patriarchy, anti-consumerism, and anti-fossil fuel economy if we're going to have half a chance to beat the climate crisis.
Those are sophisticated left-leaning arguments, Rafi, I'd like to say. But, question there would be what happened this year. I see you shaking. So perhaps not left-leaning. Perhaps that's me loading up the politics of the terms that you're using. What happens on the streets of Karachi this year, is that an evidence of patriarchy, or the capitalist system, or consumerism, or just plain incompetence by governments, as well as
certainly much more, certainly driven by consumerism. Certainly the fact that most of DHA is actually built on reclaimed land, reclaimed from the solid waste that the city has generated. So indeed, it's been the consumerism of Karachi that has laid the foundations of DHA expansion. And they've paid the cost of not knowing how much sea levels will rise, or the monsoon will shift, or its intensities will rise. So absolutely, I see that over there. But of course, Karachi it's a city of over 20 million people, has a host of other problems as well. Patriarchy notwithstanding, it has that as well. But in Karachi, I see certain other metropolitan failures, metropolitan corporation failures, stuff that civic utility should have been able to do or foresee, which goes back to the arguments that we've heard earlier today, Hassan and you have made about how really the successful things that work are decentralized and local in nature.
So Anam referred to a kind of, a mix of political economy as well as maybe, dogged or deeply entrenched attitudes in the past part of decision makers that do not allow patriarchy or whatever else to be reversed. Hassan referred to marginalizations that occur simply because these attitudes are so well entrenched that they do not allow inclusion to be programmed. So I want to come back to the idea of adaptation because that's, we have the next webinar will be devoted to other things. But in this conversation, if we can just maybe hone in on our adaptive potentials and areas of opportunity that we can identify. Where do we take this? How can we take this forward? How can we program inclusion? How can we learn from the experience of the last 6 months? How can we break path dependency? That may be asking the three of you or the four of us too much. But given the kind of political economy that Anam has identified and the other constraints that have been identified, how do we take this forward to construct a minimal agenda for advocacy? Hassan, would you like to go ahead first?
Yeah, I think some of the things that, if we put COVID aside for a second, let's just talk about this government. Some of the things that this government is doing are right. Tree plantation is a good way to build awareness. Your clean and green index for cities, that's a good initiative. It builds a performance metric. I mean, we haven't seen it work yet, but I like the idea. Our focus on waste management and water, yeah, fantastic. But we need to build beyond those. And how we can do that, I think, is first and foremost by sort of assessing at the local levels what it is that the district officers feel is important. I think those are crucial people. Your district environment officer. Each district should have one at least, right? So getting even a sense of what it is that those guys think are the priorities will give you more than what the government at the topmost level can give you. So I think some sort of activity like that would be crucial in building a sense of what happens at the local level beyond the science and policy aspects that, like the climate science aspect works up in modeling and in survey activities. But these are ways of channeling your relevant officer all the way from the topmost level to the bottom. What does that chain look like? I think clearly defining that would be very helpful now. And we have already got the structure in place for it. It's now about operationalizing it and actually making it work. Because once you get to that level, you can actually figure out what those immediate capacities are that need to be built in your district. You can tell whether you need additional GIS experts, whether you need additional atmospheric people, whether you need environmental monitoring people, all sorts of those types of people. We need to have a structure of government that does that at the local level. I think that would be a good way to begin.
Anam, would you like to answer that?
Hassan has really covered the local level really well. I'll take it a step up and talk about maybe the provincial level. So particularly we see that, and I'm going to talk from a climate finance perspective right now. We see that the annual development plans that are being made, some of them are integrating climate change and adaptation and mitigation related activities inadvertently, maybe without even realizing they're doing so. We've seen in the case of KP, for example, there's a comprehensive study about this, that the process of integrating climate change adaptation and mitigation happens very early in the budget cycle, possibly even prior to when a budget note is actually prepared for which eventually leads to the
lost Anam there. We're getting her back.
Yeah.
Anyone?
Okay. Yeah, so I was just saying that the ADP, then the annual development plan for the province, is then based on that. So the issue right now is, and the issue that you also brought up earlier, that is climate change for Pakistan only about planting trees? Unfortunately, the understanding of most of our policymakers and most parliamentarians and people who are responsible for the development of the ADPs, their understanding of climate change is very similar to environment. So they understand it only as pollution and deforestation. The temperature implications, the precipitation implications. I realize this is a very broad and sweeping statement that I've made right now, but in general, this is something that has probably been observed multiple times by many of us sitting in sessions with our policymakers, that the understanding, particularly at a more local level, isn't possibly as high as it should be. So if these people do consider climate change to only be linked to pollution and only be linked to deforestation, then naturally our ADPs and our investments in climate change are going to reflect that. So as a recommendation, of course, it's very important to be focusing on building the understanding of our policymakers on, and the reason that this is important, going beyond what all of the development sector has been saying for decades, capacity building, we're all sick of the word at this point, but it is really important to do this for policymakers because they are the ones who are going to be formulating ADPs, and they're the ones who are going to be formulating budgets. And if they know what they should be spending on, maybe we have a better chance at making better expenditures on climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. So that's my submission for that.
Rafe, any interventions in your mind?
Yes. I remember speaking to someone many years ago. They were a member of the Standing Committee on Climate Change, and they were explaining to me how they understood the job of the Ministry of Climate Change. And they said, well, it's very straightforward. It used to be the Ministry of Environment, and now it's the Ministry of Climate Change. So many of our policy makers have a very narrow understanding of what the roles and responsibilities of this ministry are. There is actually, I know Anam is talking about something over here in KP and something over here in Punjab, and something looks like adaptation, even though it's a development project. But really, given the fact that the Secretary General of the United Nations has clearly indicated we need unprecedented levels of commitment to be able to deal with the climate crisis, we're not seeing evidence of that at all. And over here, all one has to do is look at the COVID stimulus package announced by the government of Pakistan. Here we are in 2020, one of the hottest years on record, with climate awareness at an apex internationally. And we know that Pakistan is extremely vulnerable to climate change and not very resilient. Where does the stimulus money go? Construction and real estate. So you can see that the attention, the real attention, where the money is, doesn't seem to have climate concerns or ecological concerns anywhere in its ambit. And I actually invite you to have a look at this, I think it's called a Green Sustainability Index, a Green Stimulus Index, which rates the stimulus response of other countries on a sort of metric of how green they are or not. And only a handful of countries, thankfully including the EU, actually, it's considered as a bloc, so you have about a dozen countries there, have actually scored well on the Green Stimulus Index. Pakistan's fared very, very badly. So when you look at actual money and capital exchanging hands, none of it seems to be interested in adaptation plans or be concerned with climate change at all. Now, Hassan's raised a very interesting point about how we need to have localized responses. The truth is that our climate policy and the vision of our policymakers as to what climate change is far too centralized and far too generalized to be able to give you city-specific or sector-specific policy responses. It's next to impossible, therefore, to be able to give you concrete responses about what Pakistan should do, because no two areas of Pakistan are the same, and they're going to be affected differently by climate change. And we don't know what's happening there. So it's unfair almost to sort of ask, but what I can do is give you a very broad sort of my understanding of what can be done. And this stems with two problems in climate policy that I see. Well, I say one problem. It's very simple. It's in English. See, back in the days when environment and climate policy were being formulated in Pakistan, there was very limited human capacity in Pakistan. Back in the 90s, when the Environment Act and policy was being formulated in 2005, there were hardly any local graduates of environmental sciences in the market. There were hardly any courses in environmental sciences. The HEC actually started postgraduate and undergraduate and postgraduate courses in environmental sciences after the law was introduced in 1997. So come roll around 2005 or even 2010, when the Climate Task Force set to work in what eventually became the climate policy, there was no local talent here to be able to run the analysis and provide a language of understanding of climate change. And I can understand then the limitations of the policymakers who were hungry to understand, thirsty to understand what was happening in Pakistan, would have no choice but to reach out to the standard format. It's a foreign funded consultant, comes as a part of a technical assistance grant, comes and has a 30-day situational analysis of Pakistan and gives the policymakers an understanding or a broad understanding of what should happen. And the result of this is that our policy making is in English. It's also very skewed. But for the amount of time that I've been working in this field, I can now tell you that because we have a substantial now HR talent pool in environmental sciences and management in Pakistan, we not only have university courses, we have graduates from those courses. We have graduates from those courses who now have been working for 10 years and can give you, they can tell you what's happening in Pakistan. So if you want a recommendation from me, it would be listen to these people. As Hassan was saying, just listen. Listen locally, because we have the talent now. And you'll find that the language will be different. It won't be in that sort of Western, technical, Orientalist almost ways. We'll have a new discourse on climate change and hopefully a new appreciation of how profound its challenges are.
Thank you for that, Rafi. I think everybody who's spoken in this webinar, all three of you are consummate experts, and I think we've packed together a very robust, dense discussion around climate action, the deficits that apply with regard to understanding with provincial and national issues, also with regard to the deficits in our institutional approaches, as well as very much the political economy that surrounds climate action. I don't think we can, I won't push for more recommendations, because I do understand the frustration that Rafi has pointed towards, that we cannot push for something when our real action is grounded back in responses or approaches that are frankly pre-modern, where there is nothing to stand on really. There is nothing to connect the arc of the local with the international. Along that arc, we will trudge along. But here's like a parting thought that I have. We look at things at Jinnah Institute and in our work from the lens of vulnerability, from the lens of creating access and equal citizenship. And there I find that we are very much stuck in climate action in a vocabulary that is technical or administrative. There is no localized idiom, as Rafi also said. Perhaps there might be local understanding improved or at the local level, but certainly this is not reflected in our national frameworks. There is no conception of vulnerability, as Anam said, beyond the token inclusion of women or transgendered people or minors or people who are sick. They are additives in a larger calculus of what the state must do and how it must report. And report it must, of course, at UNFCCC. That reporting is also frequently based on fudged up evidence, as Hassan referred to. There is these attempts, which we can read and make sense of very clearly, are attempts in obfuscation. There is no attempt to empower the citizen. And on this curve, I feel we will for a while yet, till our adaptation, or shall I say adaptive capacities improve. I thank you all for joining us today, and Rafi is going to conduct the next session of this series. We will be engaging young experts, young or older practitioners. Ages not really, expertise is not young or old. We're going to be engaging experts as we go over the next couple of months to see if we can a case for climate change from the platform of Jinnah Institute, and if we can suggest solutions to the government and other decision makers. Thank you all very much, and hope to see you another time.
Thank you, Salman.